Do you wish you had the perfect wash recipe? Well, there's no reason to be wishy-washy about it. For the Saurian Star Host, I've been doing two color schemes based on elements, and this one is no exception. I'll be doing one based on the element of air. But seeing as how I get asked quite often how I mix my washes, well, I think now is a really good time to show exactly how, in detail. Because I printed 5 of these one-page rules Saurian Star Host Guardians, and their scales would make a really nice surface for washing. To me, they look like lizard paladins, which would make them a great candidate to be my element of air. By correlating air and heaven together, a nice angelic look to them I think will work really well for them as sci-fi paladins. A homemade wash has to take into account 3 key components: the viscosity, the finish, and the pigment type. Viscosity determines how loose the mix is. Does it pool in tiny cracks only, or does it sit more evenly over the surface? The finish determines how it looks when it dries. Something more matte might be more subtle, while something satin or glossy can really make shadows stand out. Lastly is the pigments. Do you want to stain surrounding colors, or just have pigment settle into the gaps while leaving the stuff around it mostly alone? The trick to being able to customize your own wash the way you like it is going to be using different mediums, paints, and inks to push these sliders back and forth to get exactly what we're after. For the viscosity, I have 3 options: a glaze medium for something really viscous, a flow medium for something in between, and an airbrush thinner for something really, really thin. For the finish, I've got a matte medium and a satin medium. Since I like to pick my finish first, usually the viscosity of these mediums are what determines which of the other mediums I use to get my final viscosity. And for pigments, I've got heavy body, fluid acrylic, but also acrylic ink. The difference will not only determine final viscosity, but how staining the final output will be, since inks are more fluid and have better staining based on pigment. Which brings me to the elephant in the room situation. Why? Obviously, I need a lot of stuff to make my own washes, so wouldn't it be easier to just buy some pre-mixed ones that many companies have? Yes, and sometimes they're actually the best option. But once you figure out your recipe, all you need is a few mediums and any color in your paint collection to make one, which can be a bit cheaper, though inks tend to be bought special for this kind of purpose too. So my advice is go with the options that'll give you the most utility. If you already use mediums with your normal painting, then you're not getting anything extra. But if you have contrast style paints, they can be used as washes or glazes. So you wouldn't need inks in many cases, and could replace the inks in the recipes I'm about to share with the contrast. To get started, I want to show what I normally do for washes. I like to paint in matte, so it starts with matte medium. This one's pretty thin, and I'd like to keep it in that range, so use my flow medium for further dilution. When it comes to pigment, the simplest of all of them is just the same paint used for painting the model, something we should already have if painting models, right? I'll use the same yellow I added to the gray primer for the base coat, which is this warm yellow from Chimera Colors. But I do want to darken it a bit, so we'll also add some burnt sienna. First, I'm going to paint a bit on the armor here, even though this is for his scales, because I just want to make sure I have the right volume of pigment. The difficult thing about getting the right transparency will be exactly how much paint to medium ratio to go. With just a bit of pigment, it'll be a subtle change, while a lot of pigment will give drastic results and might cover more of the original color. But the wash can handle a lot more paint than expected and still be transparent. In this case, I want to go drastic so we can really see the results and add lots of the pigment to the wash before washing it all over this lizard's scales. We can see in the final picture how the yellow covers all over, but it's a little darker where it pooled around the ridges and in the depths of the scales. This is what a wash is supposed to do, so this is the exact effect we're looking for. To To start changing things up and getting different results, I'm going to switch out individual aspects of my basic wash so we can see the differences. Starting with viscosity. So instead of my flow medium, I'm going to use this thicker glaze medium in the mix. Just a 1-to-1 drop like I did in the last mix. When we get this on the model, you can see that it doesn't pull away as much, but still pools. But it is a bit harder to put on because it doesn't flow, so it requires a bit more brush reloading than the first version. Side by side, we can see that those shadows aren't as dark because the pigment was more spread out as it dried, which leaves more of a feathering effect. This time, instead of the matte, I'm going to switch it out for the satin medium. Satin is basically an in-between of glossy and matte, so it should still have some of the sheen to it, but not a mere surface finish. Getting it on the model won't feel much different than the basic version, but when it comes to what it looks like when dry, that's when we see that while it rests in the cracks like the other two, it looks a little more saturated. That's one of the benefits of a satin finish, is that colors will look more saturated, but it'll also reflect more light, which can actually be a boon for painting something quickly. It's also usually the better choice when washing over metallics. For the last switch out, which will be switching out paint for ink, I want to do one little thing with the miniature first, and that's to give it a bit of a zenithal spray. The thing about inks is that they should stain better, though that does come down to pigment and ink brand a bit, but that means it should stain this white a yellow in addition to pooling in the recesses. So that's why I want to show this technique of doing a zenithal over a color, because I really do feel like it's a simple and swift way to paint while keeping lots of the saturation you lose with black. For the mix, it's the same as my normal wash, but instead of the burnt sienna paint, it'll be adding a brown ink. I'm going to stay with the yellow paint though, since it itself is quite staining already. And as I paint this on, we can see that it turns the white of the zenithal a yellow, while still settling in the recesses. So that when it dries, we end up with something really different to the other ones. Because the ink does more staining than settling, we can see much less color depth in the soft recesses in his scales, leaving more outlines than the thicker paint versions. Also, we can see just how yellow that white turned with just the single coat of the wash. I know some painters like to whip up large batches of these into their own empty bottles, which is totally fine if you want to do that. But I've kind of nicknamed these as palette washes myself because they're simple to whip up when needed, and there's no need to take up all that extra space on the painting desk for them for every individual color. So now that we've got the how-to out of the way, time to finish up with the lizards for my scheme. When I imagine paladins, of course I think white. But painting a pure white is just not how white looks good on models. And painting over gray, while the standard, I don't think is going to fit in with a nice vibrant yellow I've got going on here. When I was getting these prepared on stream I did on my Discord, link in the description, we joked that they kind of looked like mustard. Well, you know what goes well with mustard? Mayo. To get my mayo, I'm just going to keep it simple, and it's just going to be a mix of white and raw sienna. Something yellow, but not too yellow or too bright. I'll do a half and half mix to start, since this is going to be my base, and I don't want to start too light or there's going to be nothing in the shadows. From here, it's just adding more white and layering it up. I do want my final look to be white, but I wanted to make sure the shadows didn't have any dull colorless grays, since it'd feel less pure to me as part of the scheme. With this layer, I just avoid certain gaps and shadows, but otherwise give a pretty overall coverage with it. The last bit will just be pure white on the edges and highlight planes. This should complete my pure, airy, angelic look without anything looking like actual mayo, and give me a place to add some texture to this armor so that it looks just a little more natural as well. Okay, so I may have started him out as something holy, but quickly devolved it into a meme, as the other colors are just the rest of the hamburger. With my mustard scales and mayo armor, I made the metallic a gold, but with a dark start from browns to look like hamburger. The leather a nice bun color, the cables on his staff some green for relish, and then his finishing ketchup, red for all the glow. Though it is a bit of a cardinal sin to paint glows over bright colors, they don't really work. I was just having fun at this point. Surprisingly at the end though, it kind of all did work together to give me a great tasting, looking color scheme. Please subscribe if you like this video, and check the link in the description to my Discord where I talk all sorts of nonsense about miniatures painting, provide critique on paint jobs, and occasionally stream.